1, 2, 3, 4.
News,
culture, astronomy,
physics,
humanities,
space,
science, travel,
Boom! Knowledge! Boom! Knowledge!
History,
humor,
technology,
games.
Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are on the pale blue dot. And according to my current demographics, most likely Washington or California, though I'm expanding all the time, not unlike the universe itself. And welcome to Boom Knowledge, a podcast furiously dedicated to exploring the breadth and depth of all the things us humans have learned. It's a daunting task, particularly in the twice-weekly time allotted, but I'm up for it if you are. And of course, I'm your host, Mike Vass. Thanks for buying the ticket and taking the ride with me. Happy to have you here, and welcome to the show. And speaking of the show, just a couple of quick housekeeping and announcement items. First and foremost, thank you all for your emails, Facebook messages, comments on the website, and really all the rest of it. I've gotten some great submissions, which not only warm my heart, but also frankly make my job a lot easier too. The topic well is truly endless, but sometimes I'm so busy working everything else that I forget to stick my head down that bad boy and take a drink. So appreciate you bringing the bucket my direction and dousing me proper with its contents. I've also gotten some good critical feedback and suggestions as well, and as I've said before, I take these very seriously. I've already incorporated some of what I've heard from very smart listeners into the show, and we'll be working on more over the course of 2017 and beyond. In particular, and because saying a thing on whatever the equivalent of podcast air is will actually ensure its realization, a number of people have expressed a desire to hear me go deeper on topics overall. While I and many others enjoy the shorter segments too, I am readying myself to incorporate an additional format to the show called Deep Knowledge. So every few episodes, in addition to the short segments, frag list, and interviews I'm doing now, I'll sneak an entire show dedicated to one specific thing. I kind of started to go there with the history of classic arcade game series, as well as my episodes about celebrity deaths at the end of last year. And well, anyway, I'm readying to make this a regular thing. No precise ETA on that, but it is coming for certain and sure. And in the meantime, I very much still have a show to produce, using the sacred and trusted ways of the ancients, which are, of course, 3 short segments and a frag list. Hails to you, old ones, for your bold podcasting foundations. But you know, I got another suggestion which I think is a reasonable one. While I'm prone to jumping around between topic types on the show, as it is in my life and my brain, Trevor in Seattle suggested he might like to hear shows around a central theme. Okay, well that's easy enough. Let's give it a go. Also, careful what you wish for, because today's show will be all about death. Segment 1. We all gotta go sometime, and rich or poor, we always leave at least one thing behind: our physical form. We're going to take a look at how cultures all over the world deal with, and have dealt with in the past, human remains. Segment 2. There are all kinds of things that happen to our body after we die. Buckle on up, because I'm going to cover the lot of it in dignified scientific glory. Segment 3. Can we avoid death entirely? I don't know about you, but I'm sick of that dude. He's seriously harshing my existence mellow. Well, I'll talk about some of the ideas and advances being made to combat life's one great certainty: death. All right, this introduction is just about to draw its final breath, so let's say a few somber words on its behalf, celebrating its short but impactful life, and package it on up to send its ashes into space. Because that's what any BoomKnow introduction would want. You're gone but not forgotten, faithful intro. The show and I will see you on the other side someday. Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Let's talk about We humans are a funny lot. We are, and of course there are lots of exceptions, but generally very terrified to our core as it regards death, particularly in Western culture. Yet we go to all kinds of lengths to recognize, bookmark, ritualize, and even celebrate the experience. And it's been this way for a really long time, at least half of human existence, to the best of our understanding at this point anyway. We believe humanity originated 200,000 years ago, and the first archaeological evidence of ritual burial goes back half that time, 100,000 years. Skeletal remains discovered in a cave in Qafsa, Israel, were stained with red ochre, which is a type of earth pigment used heavily by ancient cultures. Its presence led archaeologists to surmise that there was symbolism and ritual present at the time of the burial. And there's also been some suggestion that Neanderthals buried their dead, possibly even earlier than humans, though the evidence is under some scrutiny and is contested. Regardless, we have been at this a long while. In ancient Mesopotamia, going back to 5000 BCE, Sumerians believed that the afterlife was a dark, shadowy, and miserable place, and that all dead would ultimately end up there no matter what kind of life they lived. And in spite of these beliefs, they would do their best to help the process along anyway. Bodies would be buried in the ground to provide easy access to the netherworld, which was thought to exist beneath the earth. And if you weren't buried, well, you could return as a spooky ghost to haunt the living, either as a disembodied spirit or as a function of possession, entering the ear of an unsuspecting person, maliciously screwing with their life and their health. And isn't that interesting? It's a pretty standard ghost story, right? One we would absolutely expect to find in a horror movie produced, heck, any time in the last 50 years, including right now. And yet this goes back many thousands of years to an ancient people. I just love that. The ancient Sumerians also had some thoughts on cremation, which of course is the process of burning the body. Well, first off, they didn't have access to a lot of wood, so there wasn't a lot of practicality to it. But they also believed that the heavens were the realm of the gods, or anyway, most of the gods, save Ershkigal, who dwelt below in the netherworld. So if you burned a body, turning it to ash and, more importantly, smoke, which rises upward, clearly the opposite direction of the netherworld, then you were sending them to the wrong place. As a human soul in a godly zone, you just wouldn't be at home there. Serious fish out of water. The Sumerians paved the way for the Egyptians, whose burial practices began as early as 4000 BCE. And while these practices wavered some over the next few thousand years, the focus remained on ensuring an eternal existence beyond death. And I think most people are aware there was a ton of ceremony involved here. Much has been made about the elaborate funeral practices surrounding kings and queens, but the common person wasn't excluded either. Rich or poor, the Egyptians believed that if you weren't given the correct send-off, then, again, you would return as a spooky ghost to haunt the living. Now, early in Egyptian practice, people were buried in the ground in a fetal position, with simple pots and other goods accompanying them. As Egypt's climate was very arid, the body would be preserved if buried in a sandy and a dry spot. But over time, the wealthy and the kingly longed for better. This started with interring the body in mud brick tombs called mastabas, which is an Arabic word meaning bench. And they really did look quite a bit like benches. And that, of course, extended onward and upward, culminating in the Great Pyramids. Now, unfortunately, burying above ground also meant the introduction of serious decay. And I'll get into that in the next segment. It was strongly believed that the physical form must be preserved in order to preserve the soul. So the process of mummification was introduced to ensure that the body would dry out and not deteriorate. Over time, and through no shortage of trial and error, the Egyptians became masters of this process, which included removing the brain, internal organs, rinsing the inside of the body with wine and spices, covering the corpse with salt for 70 days, stuffing the body with linen and sand to get it back to, human body shape, and of course wrapping the deceased completely in bandages. Now, I'm going to go on the record right now by saying that my final wishes in no way should follow ancient Egyptian mummification. Kind of like the idea of towering monuments, half woman, half lion, or otherwise. Maybe me riding a dragon with a sword in hand, all heavy metal Dungeons and Dragons style. But no thank you on having my insides washed out with wine and spices. I've done quite enough of that with my own living body, thank you very much. So moving on to the ancient Greeks, they also buried their dead, and like the Egyptians, employed elaborate rituals, ceremonies, and monuments. They utilized both individual graves and family tombs. And interestingly enough, while burial was the thing across most of Greece throughout the civilization's history, in Athens there was a divergence. The Athenians employed cremation, placing ashes in urns. Now, the Greeks also believed no matter whether you were cremated or buried, be it individually or in tombs, grand monuments or otherwise, it was critical to remember and honor the dead. A tradition that spawned from that particular philosophy was for sons to be named after their father's father and daughters the mother's mother. And I only really snuck this bit in because I can vouch for the fact that Greek tradition does persist into modern times. I myself am Greek and am named after my grandfather. And if I ever have a son, I may try to put in a bid for naming him after my father, Tony. Or because it's the 21st century again, I may get outvoted, and that's totally fine. There are a universe of maybes and hypotheticals there, not the least of which revolve around the fact that I am currently very much single. But anyway, moving on. The Romans buried their dead at night in order to not disrupt daily activity, and they implemented a practice of ensuring nobody was buried within the confines of a city to create a boundary between the living and the dead, but also certainly for general health reasons. And again, it was believed that if people weren't buried properly, they could return as a spooky ghost. In the ancient Americas, the Mayan people buried their dead as well and placed maize or corn within the mouths as nourishment for the soul on their journey to Xibalba. Now, Xibalba can be translated roughly as place of fear. And I looked it up. Not surprisingly, there are 3 bands named Xibalba: a thrash metal band, a death black metal band, and a hardcore band. Yep. There are some really interesting similarities between the Mayans and the Sumerians, who were really on the other side of the world from each other. Both cultures believed that the dead would make their journey best by being placed underground, close to their final destination, and both cultures believed that the destination pretty much sucked. They were places of darkness and despair and horror, and anyway, it's really easy to see why any metal band would want to take the name Xibalba. Now, all the way over in Asia, in China, ancient peoples also used burial for the dead, and included ritual and ceremony, burying objects and property within the tombs and the graves. The Chinese also worried about ceremony being employed properly to avoid, and I bet you know what I'm going to say next, the person not coming back as a spooky ghost. Now, cross-culturally, and sometimes with little to zero contact, the ancient peoples of the world really hated ghosts, and I find that fascinating. Now, it's worth mentioning as well that the extinct Bo people of the Hemp Pond Valley in southwest China hung coffins on the side of cliffs for, well, sadly, reasons unknown. They were wiped out during the Ming Dynasty, and no record remains. But how cool is that? The people of India made an interesting shift from the rest because, like the Athenians, they employed cremation, and they did so in accordance with Hinduism. And creation really wasn't employed much elsewhere. The Norse did it, the Greeks and the Romans here and there, but by the time Christianity takes hold, it was pretty much forbidden in Western culture entirely. Okay, lots of talk of burial and cremation. Let's talk about some less traditional methods for disposal. We'll start with a real biggie: cannibalism. It's a practice that goes back, right, wrong, or indifferent, to very ancient peoples. In fact, there is archaeological evidence that cannibalism goes back tens of thousands of years. But specifically in terms of body disposal, the process of endocannibalism, which is the practice of consuming someone of the same community or tribe, has been employed by the Wari in Brazil, the Melanesians of Papua New Guinea, the Kalatia in India, and so on. The Amahuaca Indians of Peru combined endocannibalism with cremation by picking bone particles out of ashes, grinding them into corn, and drinking them, which is nothing if not creative. Okay, so I can feel a few of you wigging out on the other side of the microphone. So while there are other examples, I won't belabor the point. Consumption has occurred, and we will leave it at that. And move on to exposure. The Tibetan practice of sky burial is one such example. Corpses are left at the top of mountains to decompose or to be eaten by carrion birds. This follows a belief that there is no need to preserve the body at all, which is simply an empty vessel at this point. And there are practical concerns here as well. In much of Tibet, the ground is rocky, not conducive to burial in the slightest. There's also scarcity of fuel for cremation. Exposure under these circumstances makes a ton of sense. Then there's dissolution and alkaline hydrolysis. It's a liquefaction process, currently legal in 13 states and 1 Canadian province. It is purported to be greener, and supposedly there's less carbon dioxide and pollutants than there would be in cremation. But liquefied, man. And navies the world over have practiced burial at sea, which is precisely what it sounds like. This can occur with or without a casket and post-cremation as well. Now, I've saved my favorite for last. Such notables as Gene Roddenberry and Timothy Leary have both had their ashes sent to space. It's a practice that only goes back to, really the 90s. It's in its infancy, but it's there. I long thought that this is exactly what I would want, though the older I get, the more I think a green burial might be the right thing for me, utilizing, not necessarily liquefaction, which sounds a little bit much, but practices that aim to have the least environmental impact. This includes using green caskets that are biodegradable, unlike many that contain veneers and paints that hold toxins. And basically, I'd be letting myself go without, all that carbon emission. Now, in sharp contrast to this notion of going without muss or fuss or expense, my dragon riding monument sounds pretty effin' sweet. When I was younger, I had a lot of curiosity about death. Maybe it was a little morbid, but it was also genuine, straight-up wonder, beyond the where do we go and what happens next stuff. It hasn't persisted as strong into my recent years, and it's been tempered by the fact that the older you get, the more presence death has in your life, and you can't sugarcoat any of it. Death sucks, but it's natural. As natural as plants growing, the earth's spin on its axis, the ebb and flow of the tides, and rhinos getting busy in the wild. It looks painfully awkward, but it's natural. Anyway, I debated with myself about whether to include this next segment at all, and then I was reminded how many of you read true crime novels or watch shows involving forensic pathology as a central theme. I'm certainly not alone in my curiosity by a long shot, so what the hell? Let's do this. Here's what happens when we die. And by the way, I'm no theologian, so we're just going to talk about the body here. There are a number of great texts on the subject of what's next. A few of them you may have even heard of, and I welcome you to seek them out. When you die, your heart quits keeping the beat, which actually is quite a miraculous thing, don't you think? You want to know how miraculous? An average human lifespan of 70 years will result in 2.5 billion beats, which equates to 51,100,000 gallons of blood being pumped through the entirety of the body. Holy wow, and thank you, heart. That is a job extremely well done and deserving of retirement with all that dedication, truly. So yeah, the heart retires after however many long years of service, and this is when the official time of death is marked, if such a thing is possible in the moment. The body will then go through a period known as algor mortis, which is a cooling phase, losing 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.8 degrees Celsius per hour, eventually landing at ambient room temperature, whatever that happens to be. And next up comes rigor mortis, which is, for whatever reason, a term that darn near everyone in the world is familiar with. 2 to 6 hours after death, blood coagulates in the arteries and the capillaries since, the heart having earned its permanent vacation, there is no longer any circulation occurring. The body stiffens during this period, starting with the eyelids and neck muscles, then moving on throughout the rest. Why exactly does this happen? Because the chemical ATP depletes. ATP is responsible for relaxing your muscle fibers after they contract. And whatever lovely shade of white, olive, brown, black, or as is the case with some people, orange your body is, all that starts to kind of go out the window after death. The body embraces many colors, which could solve a few of the world's dumbest problems were that process to happen universally before we die. But anyway, shades of red, purple, blue, and so forth set on in as the blood settles to the lower regions of our body thanks to our dear friend, that bending of space-time known as gravity. And eventually, we all turn black. Now, oddly enough, when we die, not everything is truly dead. Our skin cells, for example, live on for a bit. Live bacteria begins to break down the corpse. And in a bit of horror or horror comedy if you like, depending on your sense of humor, the body can twitch after death as muscles contract. This has been scaring the hell out of people for centuries. Add a little bit of gas to this process and bodies can also moan, which causes a heart attack in the observer, and then you have two moaning corpses. I went many years of my life without knowing this next fact, and only in recent years has television and movies, a place where many people, like it or not, get all their information, has this been brought up. We void our bowels. Death be not proud. Your brain is responsible for many great deeds, including managing your sphincter. Without your smart maker around to do its duty, well, I'm sure you can finish that joke yourself. Urine isn't left alone either, I'm afraid. Biology is no walk through the daisies in this regard. And since we're covering the gross side, which was inevitable, we'll also just quickly note that odors appear. Now, this one is zero surprise to me and many others, I'm sure, who have dealt with, well, things like rodent issues in your house, which is a lovely moment for a kitty cat chaser from all this morbidity. My beautiful Norwegian forest cat Zoe, who is hilarious and redonkulously fluffy and the best cat ever in the history of cats, which is, of course, a rather long history indeed. And actually, we'll just take the tangent train one stop further because I forgot to mention that the Egyptians, who loved cats, also buried their animals with all kinds of ceremony, pomp, and Egyptian circumstance, which even included kitty sarcophagi for extra good kitties. Well, anyway, Zoe, my cat, is also a master hunter. She does her job. And unfortunately, sometimes she does her job with maximum ninja stealth and disposes of the body in mystery zones, which results in my olfactory senses finding the corpse long before my visual ones do. So yeah, everything that dies smells funky. Bodies also fill with gas and bloat and expand and push everything out, eyes and tongue and blah. Also, you've probably heard that hair and nails continue to grow, and this is absolutely false. A fact I will freely admit to not having known at all until I researched this segment. What does happen is that we dehydrate. The skin shrinks up and pulls away from the nails and the hair, exposing more of each and making them appear to grow. And is it wrong that this realization makes me just a tiny bit sad? You think you know stuff. Also, as things start to settle down, I'm sorry to say, the body may explode. Okay, well that's a bit dramatic, but bursting can be a thing. And before that, there's blistering too. And I promise it's almost all over. Liquefaction of the organs. Bugs also love bodies. There's quite a bit of just natural process being natural there. And hey, let's end on a positive note. Bodies have an opportunity to release nutrients into the soil. This process supports plant life and microbial biomass. And ultimately, well, that's a really good thing. Don't you feel better, guys? Huh? Guys? Anyone? Whew, okay, we have covered some serious ground here. Let's end this podcast by looking forward. Will death always be an inevitability? Can it be cured? Well, it isn't a disease, so that statement isn't quite fair. But ending the aging process may in fact be an achievement one day realized by science. After all, certain living organisms on Earth are, for all intents and purposes, essentially immortal. This includes some type of jellyfish and bacteria as well. And other creatures live a really, really, really long time. Turtles, whales, and lobsters, just to name a few. One of the key components of aging that's being focused on right now is telomere shortening. Telomeres sit on the end of DNA strands, and every time these chromosomes divide, the telomere gets a little shorter. This happens with healing and growth, and it happens again and again and again. And eventually, the telomere gets so short that the cell can no longer replicate. This is a big deal that will absolutely lead to a terminal case of death. Another contribution to the age process is oxidative stress. This is damage caused to cells as oxygen is metabolized. Free radicals in the body are in search of a missing electron to combine with, and the charge created in that search damages cells. And still the third contributor to the aging process is glycation, which is the bonding of sugar molecules to proteins without the moderation of an enzyme. This results in more oxidative damage to the body. Now, the good news is that all these processes are well understood by science, and all three are being examined and toyed with in numerous ways by many companies, some with no shortage of dollars behind them. Now, here's a quick list. Billionaire co-founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, has invested in 14 health and biotech companies, all of which are focused on regenerative medicine. No less a company than Google Ventures has dumped nearly $2 billion in sciences designed to improve longevity and reduce disease. Calico, another $240 million Google project, is studying how to reverse aging. Craig Venture, the guy who brought us the decoding of the first human genome, has a company called Human Longevity Inc., and I'm pretty sure you can guess what they do. There's also serious active research happening on a very science fiction topic, the idea of uploading human memory and consciousness into a machine. Really, dollars are being spent. Lots of them. Will we see it in our lifetime? Well, that remains to be seen. But the focus, coupled with the understanding of the processes and problems to be solved, is truly unprecedented. And every time this topic comes up, which actually for myself and at least a few of my friends is fairly regularly, I find myself in deep consideration on one thing. How will this affect humanity? What would immortality mean to our environment, already stressed to the point of catastrophe? What are the economic implications in a world that cannot properly address poverty? And speaking of economic factors, how much will immortality cost? Will it be free? Will it only be available to the elite? And what does that particular divide look like? Will everyone have enough food to eat? And how will our brains cope with all that extra data and information? Oh boy, here's a big one. What about religion? Spirituality? Wars have been started for far, far less. Well, I don't have the answers. Nobody does. But I sure do enjoy thinking long and hard about all these questions. And I'll just say one last thing. Sign me up. Thanks for accompanying me on the journey today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of Boom Knowledge. I'm at a marketing conference in sunny San Diego right now, which is awesome, but I'm also seriously running out of time, and this was a complex episode to put together, so no frag list this round. I've written more than enough, and I have a really busy weekend ahead of me. I'll simply end by telling you to check me out on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and get a hold of me if you liked this. Have an excellent weekend. Stay alive out there. And I will see you next week in the future.
Boom Knowledge.